Most people think wealth is an asset. I do not. I think wealth is control. The asset matters, of course. The price matters, the timing matters, the tax treatment matters. But when the world turns hard, the question that separates real owners from decorative owners is much simpler than that. Who can touch it without asking permission? That is why what France just did with its gold matters far more than most people realize. Between July of 2025 and January of 2026, the Bank of France sold 129 tons of gold that had been stored at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, replaced it with equivalent gold bought in Europe, and moved the country to a place it had not been in for roughly a century. Zero French gold in the United States. None, not a symbolic pile, not a diplomatic residue, zero. And in the process, France booked a gain of about 12.8 billion euros. A lot of people heard that and thought this was a clever transaction. I heard it and thought this was a custody story. That is the only line that matters here. Not gold by itself, not France by itself, not America by itself custody. If you want to understand power, you must understand the custody gap. I call it the custody gap because the most dangerous distance in finance is not the distance between where you are and where your money is. It is the distance between ownership and permission. The moment your wealth lives inside another jurisdiction, under another emergency doctrine, behind another gate, part of what you call yours has already become conditional. Most people never learn that because normal times hide it. Normal times make convenience look like safety. Normal times make access look permanent. Normal times make cooperation look like control. Then a crisis arrives and the paper owner meets the gatekeeper. France just decided it did not want to meet the gatekeeper later. It wanted to remove the gate. Now, the official explanation was technical. The bars in New York, we were told, did not meet modern standards for liquidity and trading. So France sold older bars in the American market and bought equivalent modern bars in Europe, then stored those in Paris. Technically, that explanation is fine. In markets, technical explanations are often true. They are just not always complete. If a man changes the locks on his front door the week after a burglary across town, and then tells me he only did it because the old mechanism was outdated, I do not call him a liar. I call him incomplete. The older bars may indeed have been inconvenient. European markets may indeed have been better suited for modern gold trading. The transaction may indeed have been more efficient than physically dragging old bars across an ocean, refining them, and sending them home. All of that can be true at the same time. But when a major nation finishes removing the last of its gold from the United States, after nearly 100 years, you are not looking at metallurgy. You are looking at memory incentives and strategic control. You are looking at the custody gap being closed. I want you to notice the arithmetic, because arithmetic keeps emotion honest. France sold 129 tons across 26 transactions over 7 months. It did not rush. It did not grandstand. It did not light a diplomatic fire. It walked out carefully transaction by transaction in a way serious owners often do when they want results without theater. That operation generated roughly 12.8 billion euros in capital gains. One line item of strategic action was large enough to swing the central bank from a 2024 net loss of about 7.7 billion euros to a 2025 net profit of about 8.1 billion euros. That is not just elegant. That is a lesson. The lesson is that sovereignty and accounting can move together. The public likes to imagine that strategic independence is expensive, ideological, and abstract. Sometimes it is, but sometimes the world offers a strange gift. Sometimes you can reduce dependence, increase control, and get paid for doing it. France did. And that is what smart actors recognize before everyone else does. They know that when an old structure stops fitting the world, you do not wait until the strain becomes visible. You use the transition itself as the profit event, that is, mechanism number one. In this story, I call it the convenience illusion. The convenience illusion tells you that because something is easy, liquid, prestigious, and widely accepted, it is also safe. It is a very expensive illusion. For decades, storing gold in New York made perfect sense on the surface. Deep markets established custody, familiar legal frameworks, the prestige of the American financial system, the quiet assumption that if the reserve currency issuer holds your asset, then access is permanent and politically neutral. That assumption worked wonderfully right up until the world began reminding everyone what sovereign power really means. A reserve asset held in another country is not just a reserve asset. It is a reserve asset plus the political temperament of the host. It is a reserve asset plus the emergency powers of the host. It is a reserve asset plus the future unknowns of the host. That extra bundle is never priced correctly in calm periods because human beings are wired to underpay for tail risk. We do it in households, we do it in companies, we do it in nations. We prefer smooth routines to uncomfortable truths. We confuse habit with durability. We tell ourselves that because a system has not been weaponized against us, it cannot be. That is not analysis, that is borrowed confidence. France move matters because it says quietly but unmistakably. That borrowed confidence is no longer good enough. Now, if you want to understand why France of all countries would care about this, you have to step back and remember that French monetary history has never been sentimental about American stewardship. Charles de Gaulle understood something that many modern elites spend their whole lives trying not to understand. Monetary sovereignty is not a speech. It is not a treaty clause. It is not a phrase for conferences. It is the physical and legal ability to reach your reserves without another power smiling at you while deciding whether today is a good day to honor the arrangement. That is why France repatriated most of its gold from the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England between 1963 and 1966. De Gaulle did not challenge dollar dominance because he disliked elegant paperwork. He challenged it because he understood that when one country writes the rules, prints the settlement asset, and stores the collateral, the rest of the world is free only until the rule writer becomes uncomfortable. Most people hear that and think in ideological terms. I think in business terms. If your supplier sets the price, writes the contract, controls the delivery route, and holds your inventory, you do not have a partnership. You have dependents with better manners. France has known that for a very long time. So why leave any gold in New York at all for decades afterward? Because mechanism number 2 is stronger than ideology. I call it the diplomatic residue. Large systems do not move all at once. They leave leftovers. They keep a piece in the old arrangement because shifting everything is cost, because old bars are awkward, because routines become institutional furniture, because nobody wants to pick a fight when the old setup still mostly works. 5% here, a residual stack there, a gesture to convenience, a nod to tradition, a decision postponed, because the pain is invisible. That is how dependence survives, not through dramatic surrender, through tolerated leftovers. This is one of the oldest patterns in finance. The part that ruins you is rarely the giant obvious error. It is the residue you never bothered to clean up because you told yourself it was too small to matter, until the world changes and the residue becomes the whole point. According to the source material behind this story, France had kept a remaining slice of gold in New York for years, and then a 2024 internal audit recommended completing the withdrawal. Read that sentence carefully. Audits do not create reality. They surface what institutions have finally become willing to admit about reality. Something changed, or more accurately, several things changed at once. That brings me to mechanism number 3, the sanction memory. If you want to know when custodial trust breaks, watch what happens after a frozen asset event. The freezing of Russian central bank reserves after the invasion of Ukraine did more than punish Russia. It taught every central bank on earth the same brutal lesson. Assets parked inside the Western legal and payments architecture are not inert stores of value. They are conditional claims floating inside a geopolitical order. Now, before somebody misreads me, I am not making a moral defense of Russia. Morality and mechanism are not the same thing. You can think a sanction is justified and still understand that it changes the incentive map for every other player. That Freeze told the world that reserves can be immobilized at scale when political conditions become severe enough. Once that precedent exists, no serious treasury manager can pretend not to have seen it. And once you have seen it, you have two choices. You can keep telling yourself your situation is different, or you can start reducing the custody gap before history chooses for you. France did the second. That is why the official explanation matters less than the pattern. The bars may have needed modernization, the trade may have been efficient, the gains may have been attractive, but the timing sits inside a world that has just been reminded very loudly that the location of your reserves is part of the risk equation. People love to talk about diversification in a childish way. They think diversification is just owning different tickers, different sectors, different maturities, different countries. Real diversification begins before the asset. It begins with jurisdiction. If all your wealth can be frozen by one legal regime, one emergency order, one payment rail, or one political pivot, you are not diversified. You are concentrated and merely well-dressed. France just acted like an owner who understands that. Now look at the numerical side again, because numbers tell you where the emotion is justified and where it is not. France's total reserves are about 2,437 tons, worth more than $200 billion at recent prices. After this operation, all of it sits in French vaults. That sentence is worth more than most speeches. All of it sits in French vaults. Not conceptually French, not diplomatically French, not historically French, physically and legally French. This is what mechanism number 4 looks like. I call it jurisdictional spread. Investors talk all the time about interest, rate spread, credit spread, valuation spread. Very few talk, honestly, about jurisdictional spread, even though it can overwhelm every other spread in a crisis. Jurisdictional spread is the difference between an asset you own and an asset you can command. That difference is tiny in calm times. It can become everything in stress times, if you think that sounds abstract. Let me make it concrete. In 1933, the United States used executive power to force Americans to surrender gold. In 1971, the United States ended dollar convertibility into gold, unilaterally changing a monetary promise central to Bretton Woods. Again, morality is not the point, mechanism is the point. When national interest collides with prior assumption, the rule book bends toward power. It always has, it always will. A child thinks a contract is protection. An adult eventually learns that a contract is strongest precisely when no one urgently wants to violate its spirit. Once urgency enters, power begins reading the fine print with a different face. That is why I pay attention whenever people speak as if border custody is automatically neutral. Neutral until when, neutral under which administration, neutral after which war, neutral during which financial accident, neutral once whose domestic politics begin to deteriorate. The wrong question is whether the host country is your friend today. The right question is whether you want your emergency asset to depend on future friendship at all. France just answered that question in the adult way. Number. And here is where the story gets sharper. It is not only that France eliminated the custody gap, it did so profitably and without visible punishment. That matters because successful exits create imitation. That is mechanism number 5. I call it the template effect. Once a serious actor demonstrates that you can leave an old system book gains, strengthen autonomy, and suffer no obvious retaliation, the exit stops looking radical. It starts looking available. That is when the copycat phase begins. The source material mentions a German economist calling it risky to keep so much national gold in the United States under the current geopolitical climate. Whether Germany moves next partially or more aggressively is almost secondary to the more important point. The thought has escaped the room. Once sovereign custodial risk becomes sayable in mainstream policy language, it becomes actionable. And if Germany acts, the signal intensifies. Germany's gold holdings are enormous. Italy's are enormous. Other European states have meaningful holdings too. A slow sequence of technical modernizations, portfolio rebalancings, and reserve relocations can be described politely in public while still meaning exactly what they mean in strategy. We prefer our wealth under our own rules. That is not anti-American language. That is pro-owner language. And there is a difference. I have spent my life around people who confuse optimism with discipline. They believe that because a relationship has been useful, it must remain reliable. That is not how ownership works. A good owner does not insult a bridge. He simply notices when it has become his only route out, then he builds another one. That is what France did. Now, I want to take this away from states and bring it to the human level, because this is where most listeners either wake up or go back to sleep. You may never manage a sovereign balance sheet. You may never move 129 tons of anything, but the same custody logic governs your life. A surprising number of people who think they own their future are actually renting access to it. Their income depends on one employer, one geography, one policy environment, one payment system, one tax treatment, one social mood, one market narrative, and one version of normal. They call that security. I call it a stacked custody gap. Their retirement assets are technically theirs, but accessed through layers they do not control. Their savings are real, but their liquidity depends on institutions they do not understand. Their home is an asset, but all their net worth is trapped in one local market. Their career looks stable, but they have no refusal power because one interruption would force them to accept bad terms. Then they ask why they feel rich on paper and anxious in private. Because they have assets without command. Because they have value without sovereignty. Because they have spent years optimizing convenience and almost no time optimizing access under stress. That is why this French gold story matters to ordinary people. It is not about copying a central bank. It is about learning the hierarchy. First command, then location, then structure, then yield. Most people do it in reverse. They chase yield before structure. They chase appearance before command. They chase the illusion of more while ignoring the risk of not being able to reach what they already have. I do not admire that. I do not call it investing. I call it sleeping in somebody else's vault and bragging about the square footage. If you really understand what France just did, your identity starts to change. You stop thinking like a collector of assets and start thinking like a designer of access. That is the identity flip in this story. And it is one of the most valuable flips in finance. The old identity says, I have enough if the statements are large enough. The new identity says, I am safe when the distance between ownership and permission becomes small enough. The old identity wants performance. The new identity wants command first, performance second. The old identity asks, what does this pay? The new identity asks, under whose rules do I get paid? How fast can those rules change? And what happens if everyone smiles until the day they do not? That may sound severe. Good finance should sound severe when you are discussing emergency assets. Nobody buys fire insurance because they expect a tasteful afternoon. Now let me return to France, because the choreography of the move is worth studying. France did not physically sail those exact old bars home. It sold them in the American market and bought modern equivalents in Europe. That choice tells you a lot about how sophisticated exits happen. Naive people think strategic independence always looks dramatic: ships, speeches, flags, confrontation. Real strategic independence often looks boring. It looks like execution quality. It looks like minimizing friction. It looks like swapping out an awkward asset for a superior version closer to home, with the accounting gain arriving almost as a side effect. That is how adults leave systems quietly, profitably, in a way that makes the old arrangement hard to defend, except through nostalgia. And nostalgia is one of the most dangerous forces in markets because it makes decaying advantages feel permanent. New York was the unquestioned gold custodian for a very long time. The Federal Reserve benefited not only from legal structure and infrastructure, but from what I would call prestige inertia. Everyone assumed the center would remain the center because it had been the center. But prestige is not permanent capital. Prestige is rented from performance and trust. Once trust starts thinning, prestige can remain on the building long after it has started, leaving the behavior. France's move is behavior. That is why I treat it as more important than the explanation wrapped around it. There is another numerical detail. Many people glide past too quickly. France still holds around 134 tons of older bars and coins in Paris that may be upgraded by 2028. If prices remain supportive, that means this is not merely a one-off historical cleanup. It is part of a longer modernization and control process. Owners do not just exit, they continue refining the balance sheet after the exit. That is another lesson ordinary people miss. They think freedom is a moment. It is not. Freedom is a maintenance discipline. You keep cleaning the structure, you keep reducing dependency, you keep converting awkward forms of wealth into stronger forms of wealth. You keep watching where legal, operational, and psychological friction still exists. That is what nations do when they are serious. That is what families should do when they are serious. Now, let me say something that may bother people who prefer comforting language. A lot of what is called financial sophistication today is really just elegant dependence. The more layered the system, the more people applaud it. Global custody, cross-border efficiency, synthetic exposure. Policy backstops, institutional wrappers, structured convenience, fine. But every layer adds a hand, and every extra hand is a future permission point. Sometimes those layers are worth it. I am not a romantic. I understand scale. I understand market infrastructure. I understand that the modern world runs through institutions and networks, not coin purses and mattresses, but intelligent participation in a system is different from total emotional surrender to it. You want to benefit from systems without becoming helpless before them. That is the mature position. France did not leave the gold market. France changed where the last gate stands. That difference is everything. This is why I say the real asset in this story is not gold. The real asset is optionality under your own jurisdiction. Gold is simply the object through which the principle becomes visible. If you can grasp that, you start seeing the world differently. You start noticing which countries are trying to reduce exposure to dollar settlement. You start noticing reserve diversification. You start noticing regional payment infrastructure. You start noticing when allies use technical language to describe strategic distancing. You stop laughing off small reallocations because you understand that the first move in a structural shift almost always arrives disguised as housekeeping. By the time the public recognizes the pattern has already paid the early movers. That is how systems change, not with one giant announcement, with a sequence of reasonable decisions that all point one way. This is also why I do not enjoy hearing people say, if France really distrusted the United States, they would say so openly. No, they would not. Adults managing sovereign wealth rarely announce distrust in plain language when they can express it in the movement of assets. Capital is a far more honest sentence than diplomacy. Diplomacy says, this was technical. Capital says, we would rather hold everything at home. Believe the feet, ignore the smile if you must choose. And now we come to the part that matters most for the future. Once the template exists, the cost of imitation falls. If Germany can sell older bars in one jurisdiction, buy compliant bars in Europe, repatriate a chunk, and frame the whole process as prudent reserve management, then a politically sensitive move becomes bureaucratically digestible. That is how big structures unwind. The public expects revolutions, institutions prefer memos. One memo here, one audit there, one modernization program, one reserve review, one allocation adjustment, one transportation contract. 1 quarter of silence, then another nation wakes up with more control and less dependence than it had before. You do not need fireworks when you have procedure. This is why I say the French move is not just a profitable trade. It is a permission test passed in advance. That phrase matters. So let me slow down on it. A permission test is the question you ask before stress, not during stress. If conditions turn adversarial, who must let me act? Who can slow me down? Who can condition access? Who can redefine the rules in the name of emergency, legality, sanctions, stability, politics, or public necessity? If the answer includes too many names, you do not fully own what you think you own. France reduced the answer to one name, France. That is what serious ownership sounds like. Now let me speak plainly to the person listening who has spent years trying to build a life and still feels a quiet unease they cannot explain. Your unease may not be about not having enough, it may be about not controlling enough. There is a difference. A man with modest assets and low permission risk can sleep better than a man with large assets and high permission risk. The first man may have less money, he may still have more sovereignty. and sovereignty compounds in ways that statements do not show. It gives you refusal power, it gives you timing power, it gives you emotional stability because your future is not hanging from one wire someone else can cut. That is why I care so much about cash reserves. Low leverage, plain structures, and understandable businesses. People think that is old-fashioned. Number it is anti-fragility by design. It is what happens when you stop worshiping appearance and start respecting the custody gap. The more your life requires uninterrupted cooperation from distant institutions, unstable politics, generous credit markets, and friendly timing, the more fragile your success really is. You may look sophisticated, you may be one shock away from obedience. France just rejected obedience in reserve form. There is another human truth buried in this story as well. People delay reducing risk when the present arrangement flatters them. New York flattered everyone. It signaled membership in the center. It signaled trust in the anchor system. It signaled belonging to the post-war order that most of Europe benefited from. Human beings cling to flattering arrangements far longer than they should because leaving them feels like disrespect, ingratitude, or unnecessary alarm. But wealth is not a manners contest. Wealth is not there to make your counterparties feel comfortable. Wealth is there to survive your mistakes, the world's mistakes, and the moments when one country's internal pressures become everybody else's external problem. Once you understand that, you stop asking whether an exit looks impolite. You ask whether staying looks naive. That is a much better question. So what is the blueprint here? Not a slogan, not a sermon. A blueprint. I would build it on 5 operating rules. Keep essential reserves where the chain of access is shortest and clearest. Keep your emergency layer in forms and places that do not require optimistic assumptions about the kindness, speed, or neutrality of distant actors. Reduce legal and operational complexity where complexity does not pay you enough for the extra permission risk. Prefer structures you can explain under stress, because confusion is expensive at exactly the moment you can least afford it. Build refusal power because the ability to say no to bad timing is one of the highest return assets a person or a nation can own, and perform regular residue audits, because the leftovers you postpone reviewing are often where old dependencies hide. That may sound simple. It is simple. Simple is not the same as easy. The reason most people do not live this way is not lack of intelligence. It is that this way of thinking forces a confrontation with things they would rather postpone: concentration risk, institutional dependency, leverage hidden inside convenience. The emotional cost of admitting that part of their life only works if external conditions remain polite. France appears to have confronted that most individuals never do until they are forced. Do not wait to be forced. That is one of the few useful warnings I can give with total confidence. If you read this event correctly, you will also understand something larger about the American century. Great powers do not usually lose credibility all at once. They lose it at the margin first, one exception, one freeze. One emergency measure, one ally quietly hedging. One alternative market deepening somewhere else. One piece of infrastructure that becomes optional when it used to feel permanent. Then the narrative remains intact for years while the behavior underneath it changes. By the time the narrative catches up, capital has already moved. This is not a prediction of collapse. I do not traffic in dramatic cartoons. It is something more serious than that. It is a recognition that dominance rests on habit and trust as much as raw capability. When habit weakens and trust becomes conditional, the structure can remain huge while becoming less central. France is telling you something with its feet. It is saying that convenience in New York is no longer obviously superior to command in Paris. It is saying that legal jurisdiction now matters more than old prestige. It is saying that reserve management in the 21st century is no longer just about price and liquidity. It is about political optionality. Once that sentence becomes mainstream, the custodial map begins to change. And when the custodial map changes, the monetary map is never far behind. Why? Because gold is not merely an inert metal in this story. It is the cleanest test object for trust. If you do not want a counterpart to hold your hardest reserve asset, why would you unquestioningly want them to sit at the center of everything softer? Why would you assume permanent neutrality for claims that are even more abstract, more digitally routed, more legally layered, and more policy sensitive than gold? This is how a gold story becomes a dollar story without anybody needing to shout. And this is how mature investors think. They do not wait for the headline that confirms the entire chain. They follow the first honest move. France made an honest move. Now, I want to leave you with a mirror, because a story like this is useless. If you admire it and do nothing with it, ask yourself a brutal question. If the world became less cooperative 5 years from now than it is today, how much of what you call yours would still be reachable on your terms? Not eventually, not after forms, not after approvals, not after markets reopen, not after a committee meets on your terms. If the answer disappoints you, then you have found your custody gap. And if you have found your custody gap, you have also found your work. Do not decorate it. Do not rationalize it. Do not call dependence diversification, because that sounds sophisticated. Close it while times are still normal enough that action feels optional. That is exactly when the best action gets taken. France did not wait for a locked door. France moved while the door still opened smoothly. That is why this event matters, not because gold went from one vault to another, because a serious owner looked at a century-old arrangement and asked the only question that matters in the end. When the world turns hard, who holds the key? Then it made sure the answer was no longer somebody else. There are two kinds of people who will hear this story. The first kind will say it was merely technical, merely efficient, merely an accounting event, merely old bars swapped for new bars. They will keep living the way they already live. They will keep confusing access with ownership. They will keep leaving their future inside systems. They have never tested. They will keep praising convenience until convenience sends them a bill. The second kind will hear something else. They will hear that control has a geography. They will hear that sovereignty exists at the level of households as well as nations. They will hear that every system eventually reveals whether it serves you or merely rents you a feeling of safety. They will begin shortening the distance between ownership and permission in their own lives. That second path is harder in the short run. It is often less flashy. It may even look paranoid to people who have never paid the price of dependence. I do not care. The future rarely belongs to the people who looked relaxed while the structure quietly changed. It belongs to the people who noticed the gate before everyone else discovered it was there. That is the choice in front of you. You can spend the next decade building a larger pile inside somebody else's rules and call that success. Or you can spend it building a life, a balance sheet, and a mind that can still act when the rules get rewritten. One path flatters you early and tests you late. The other disciplines you early and frees you late. Pick carefully. Because the world is moving toward a harsher truth, not a softer one. Political systems are more willing to weaponize finance. Institutions are more willing to classify extraordinary actions as necessary. Jurisdictions are more openly part of the investment equation. The age when people could pretend custody did not matter is ending. France saw that it sold, bought, moved, and closed the gap. The bars changed vaults. The lesson is much bigger. Real wealth is not what is in your name. Real wealth is what remains in your command when conditions turn against you. That is the contract. That is the test. And whether you are a nation with 2,437 tons of gold or an individual trying to protect the savings of a lifetime. The final question is exactly the same. When pressure rises, do you own your reserves or do you merely visit them? Answer that honestly, and your next move becomes obvious.